Hey everybody. I sometimes get requests to make very basic intros on how to program C# in Unity, so that's what this is. I'm going to go ahead and assume you know at least a little bit about both programming and Unity. So if you've never programmed before, I recommend that you go over to GameMaker. They have a visual scripting language that's very easy to use. And if you've never used Unity before, I recommend that you learn how to do stuff like this before you start to try and program in it. But assuming that you know at least the basics, let's go ahead and talk about how you program stuff in Unity. The first thing you have to realize is that every piece of code you write will be in response to something happening. So when the game starts, do this. Each frame, do this. When the player presses a button, do this. And once you understand that that's what the code is for, you can start to plan out exactly what you need to program and how you're going to program it. So as an example, what I've got here are two very basic Unity default assets. I've got the terrain asset, and I've got the first-person shooter character asset. So these are built right into Unity. You should be able to just go over here into Assets and hit Import Package. There's characters, there's environment, so you can build this exact same thing if you'd like. Now, what's important to realize is that the character controller is really quite complicated, but it's built on the same fundamental idea. When the player presses forward, the character is supposed to move forward. When there's no ground, the character is supposed to fall. So, these sorts of basic setups are what we're going to be talking about, but a character controller is one of the most complicated things that you can program. So, rather than starting there, I recommend that you use the default character controller. So, just start with something a little easier. And that's what we're going to do, because this character controller doesn't do everything. It just lets you move around. It doesn't actually shoot. There's no guns. So that's what we're going to build. We're just going to teach you how to do guns, because why not, right? The important thing to realize is that the character controller is responding to inputs, and the inputs it's responding to are these. Edit, project settings, input. There's a list. Just by default, it's filled out with stuff like this, and the character controller responds to things like horizontal, vertical, jump, mouse X, mouse Y. So with that in mind, what we would like to respond to is fire 1, which is mouse 0. Because of that, we're going to have to figure out a way to trigger when mouse 0 is pressed. So let's go ahead and create a script to do that. I've created a directory called scripts. There's nothing magical about the name of the directory or anything. It's just a good habit to get into. And we're going to go and call this a gutter. And pop this open. Your IDE might be the Microsoft IDE. That's fine. There's really no difference between them. You should still see this same setup. So this is the class, and if you don't know what a class is, you probably need to go learn that first. But these functions run automatically when certain things happen in Unity. And these are the two default functions, start and update. Update happens each frame, start happens at the beginning. But there's lots of others, and I'll show you a couple of them. If you want to know what sort of thing you can do, you can just search for Unity events, and you'll come up with this giant list, mono behavior events. There's a huge list, and you can use all of those to trigger your code. In our case, we're going to want to check every frame. And what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to check every frame if the player clicked the mouse button. So, how do we do that? There we are. There's a class called input. And if we type input and then hit period, we get the list of every single thing we can do with this input. And it's quite a list. But what we're really interested in is either get mouse button down or get button down. The difference is that get mouse button down is specifically for the mouse buttons, whereas get button down, you can rearrange it and make it whatever you want. So get button down, we'll be able to type in fire 1. And if you spell it wrong, Unity will complain when you hit play, but this is a little bit more flexible. It lets us use control as an alternate fire scheme. It lets us change what's going on. It lets the players set up different controls. So rather than responding specifically to mouse button 0 down, it's usually best practice to map that to one of the inputs. Rather than trying to do anything, we're going to use another class called debug, where we'll go ahead and just debug it. Bang, bang. Right? So this is us. An event, a check, say something. So Each frame, check if we've clicked, and if we have, say bang bang. Very basic. Here's the console, and this is where it should pop up, right? Do you think it's going to pop up? No, of course not. Because we never put it into the scene. So right now it just kind of exists as a theoretical thing in our code base. We really need to add it to the FPS controller. Here's a secret with the FPS controller. There's a body and a head. And the head is actually the thing that moves up and down when you move the mouse up and down, because otherwise the whole body would rotate backwards and forwards. It would be very strange looking. We actually want to add it to the head, just so that it's actually pointed where we're trying to look, rather than straight ahead at pelvis height. So now when we hit play, and I stupidly didn't turn the console back on. There we are. Now when we hit play, we can see bang, 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 and you can see the number on the right going up every time I click. So now we've responded to an event. We've figured out how to get our code to run when we want it to run. The second half is how to make it do what we want it to do. And that's always going to be the way it works. How do you get it to run, and what does it do? So, what does it do? Well, we want it to fire a bullet. So let's go ahead and create a bullet for it to fire. We're going to create a sphere. That's a little too big. So let's go ahead and bring it down to, say, 0.2, 0.2, 0.2. There's a sphere that's more manageable in size. So if we wanted to make this into a bullet, it would need to be able to move, and by default this sphere won't move. It's just going to hover there. So what we're going to want to do is add the Unity physics thing to it, and that's called a rigid body. A rigid body, or rigid body 2D, depending on the number of dimensions you're using. And there it is. If you look over at the FPS controller, it's also got a rigid body. Rigid bodies are super, super common. But I'm going to go ahead and teach you one quick little trick. This bullet is going to be moving very, very fast, so we're going to want to switch over to continuous, or it might fall through the floor. That's just a math thing. You don't have to worry about that too much. It's not programming related, but it'll save you a lot of pain if you're making some kind of gunplay game to know that that's how you make it not fall through the floor. Now when we hit play, where'd it go? There it is. It must have fallen faster than I thought here. Let's just move it a little bit so we can see it a little better. Yeah, there you see it. So what we're going to want to do is save this as a prefab. We'll call it bullet. And we'll drop it into our prefabs directory. Again, there's nothing magical about this directory. It's just there to help us organize our stuff. There are some magic directories, but these are not them. So let's go ahead and delete it from the scene. And what we'll do is we will make it so that when we click our mouse button, one of those bullets fires out of our face. And in order to do that, we're going to have to program this to fire a bullet. How do we do that? Well, first we need to specify what bullet we're going to fire. So public, that's not how you spell it, public, game object, bullet. And then over here, when we can look at it, it'll recompile, and there we are. So this lets us coordinate what we're doing, and we can just drag the bullet prefab into this. And there, we now have a link so that we know what bullet we're trying to fire. And if we had a bunch of guns or something, every gun would probably have its own bullet, and the gun would be what was doing this gunning. But since we're just doing a demo, we'll just make our face spit bullets, and that's the bullet we're going to spit. Now all we have to do is tell the code to put one of those in the scene. So we're going to do exactly that here. Instead of saying bang bang, let's go ahead and put the bullet in the scene. Now, the magic word for that is instantiate. So we're going to instantiate the bullet. Pretty basic, right? So there are some magic words that you're going to need to know in order to do this stuff, but if you search, you can probably figure out what they are. A lot of basic tutorials cover this sort of stuff, and the key is just to know how to get your code to run and what you want it to do. And in this case, we want it to spawn a bullet. So that's what we've done. That is quite a stack. I see there's no floating point errors in this math. Bump, there we are. So that's fine, but we don't want to build some kind of weird snowman. We would like it to shoot out of our face. So to do that, we're going to have to put it at our face. there's actually a lot of arguments you can pass to instantiate, more than you might think. For example, we can pass it the parent to load it into, but we don't want it to be a child of our face, because then it moves when we move our face, and that doesn't make any sense. Well, here, we can give it a position and a rotation. That's perfect. So that's what we'll do. What sort of position and rotation? Well, here's another magic word, transform. Everything has a transform, and we want the transform.position, and we'll go ahead and give it the transform.rotation as well. And that way it'll spawn directly on our face, but we don't actually want it to spawn inside of our face. If we try that, it's going to like knock us around, and that's going to be a little bit uncomfortable. So what we would like it to do is spawn a little bit in front of our face. Fortunately, transform is a wonderful tool, and we can just say transform.forward. See? So that's going to start 1 meter in front of our face. Transform is this thing here. Every game object has a transform. Everything in the scene has a transform, and it's super useful. So I definitely recommend knowing what a transform is. And what we need to do now is, outside of the transform, it's the rigid body. So what we need to do is have these bullets fly forward, and the rigid body is what controls that. So how do we get the rigid body from this bullet? Well, first we need to know what the bullet is. Right now we're kind of blindly instantiating it, so we're going to go ahead and just save it as a variable. And then what we're going to do is we're going to say rigid body equals, I guess there's no capital B in that, I always forget, equals new bullet dot get component rigid body. So this here is a little bit of C# syntactical magic. Now, get component is something you're always going to be using, right? Because that just grabs a mono behavior off of the object, and we're looking for the rigid body mono behavior. So when we do this, you can pass it a lot of things, like a system type or the string rigid body, but that's really not the best way to do it. That's left over from back when you could use JavaScript and stuff. The C# way to do it is to use these angular brackets, which simply mean type of. So this is a generic function. It's a function that will take in an argument of a type, and this is how we specify the type. You're going to find a lot of stuff can do that. And for example, instantiate can do that. We can pass instantiate a type as well. There's no need to in this case, but this is not a scary thing. All you have to know is that it means that class. It may look a little scary if you're not used to C# though. Anyway, then we have to tell rigid body to fire forwards. Rigid body dot, oh, look at all the stuff we can do with rigid bodies. They're so cool when they work. Well, what we really want to do is set the velocity, right? So there's the velocity. Rigid body to velocity equals transform.forward times 10. Sure, just move it in the same direction that we spawn it in front of our face. It sounds like a good one. Let's try it on. Boop, boop, boop. Well, they're not exactly flying out of our face, are they? But they are going in the right direction, and we can probably turn this into exactly what we want it to be. All we really have to do is multiply this value. But rather than arbitrarily multiply it, this is called a magic number, and it makes maintaining your code extremely difficult and annoying. So what you generally want to do is put in a public float velocity, bullet velocity, I suppose, so we don't get confused, and then we set it there, right? And then here we just say times bullet velocity. Now, when we look at this gunner script, the velocity will pop up here, and we can just edit it however we need to edit it. And that's really, really handy in comparison to having to do everything in code. It's also very nice because you can create a whole bunch of variants. So you could have bullets guns that fire slower bullets and guns that fire faster bullets. And it's just a good way to do things. So that's the recommended method. And now you can see that our bullets are firing, but they're kind of just like bouncing off into the sky rather than exploding when they hit the ground, right? We would really like them to explode. How do we make them explode? Now, 10 minutes ago, this might have felt like it was kind of a question you didn't know the answer to, but you should know the answer to it now. There is an event for slamming into things. is called onCollisionEnter, and that's what we're going to use. Obviously, we can't put it on the player's face. That doesn't make any sense. We have to put it on the bullet, so we're going to need a new script, which we'll call bullet. Very clever, I know. We're going to open this up and put in a new function, void onCollisionEnter. And you can look this stuff up. You're not expected to memorize it. Yeah, I think it's collision. I almost always have to look it up as well. So this is not something you're expected to memorize. None of this stuff is. Coders who have been coding for 30 years still look stuff up. What is the exact way to type this and that sort of stuff? It's totally normal. Just get used to Googling it. Anyway, what we would like to do is when we collide with something, we want to blow up. We want to destroy ourselves. Well, here's another magic word, destroy. Now, we could say destroy this, but this is just the bullet class, the mono behavior. It's not the actual bullet. So if we do that, it just means the bullet stops being a bullet and continues on being a round object that bounces. So rather than destroying this, we want to destroy the game object we're attached to. And that way it'll just completely go away. So that is a good way for us to have this happen. We're also going to go ahead and put in a debug.log, bang, just so that, or pow, I guess, just so that we can see it happening as well when we're looking at our console. Again, the bullet won't do anything unless it's on something that's going to be in the scene. So what we need to do is load it onto our bullet prefab. There we go. Otherwise, it would never run. If it's not in the scene, it's probably not going to run unless you're doing something really interesting. Boom, 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 boom. And you can see that the console shows us a bunch of POWs. You know what, though? I would like our bullet to properly explode with a particle effect that's like kaboom. Sounds good. Let's go ahead and create a particle effect. Now, this is just kind of testing what you already know because you already know how to do this. We've already done it. You're just doing the same thing again, and that's how it always works. What we are going to do, however, is just change this to a sphere and make it so that it is a pulse. Just a quick little thing to make it a little bit more... come on. Why can't I... Oh, I turned off the emission. Sorry. There we are. Boom. And we're not going to have it loop. And then this will be our bullet explosion. So we'll just call this explosion. And obviously that's a very, very primitive explosion. But you can spend all day trying to polish your explosion. You don't need me to help you with that. At least not in this particular example. So what we want to do is we want the bullet to spawn the explosion when it dies. And we already know everything about that. So if you're following along at home, public game object explosion, and then down here we say instantiate explosion transform.position transform.rotation. Does that look familiar? Because it's literally the exact same thing. So now when we hit play and we fire a bullet, nothing happens because we didn't assign it. See that? The variable explosion has not been assigned. And you'll forget to do that all the time. You always have to remember to hook things up. If you don't hook things up, they're not going to run. And that's one of the things that people really get annoyed by most, I think. Getting your code to run is critical, and it's something that Unity isn't very helpful with. So you always have to remember that if it's not running, it may just be that you forgot to wire it into the scene. Boom, 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 boom. Now, of course, the problem with this is that the explosions stay around. You can see that giant stack of explosions off to the left there. And that means that we've got a whole bunch of game objects in the scene that aren't doing anything. They're just sitting there. And, you know, there's a way to solve that. We can simply delete them after 5 seconds. And to do that, we could create a new script. We could just create a script to self-destruct after a second. And I'm sure you can figure that out, but I'm going to do it for you just to show you one last thing you're going to need to know. Die. So we're going to go ahead and put in a public float time, and we're going to make that equal to 5 seconds because that happens to be the time on the timer, on the particle effect. But of course, that's something we can adjust because it's going to pop up in our inspector. And then down here, what we can do is we can say time minus equals capital T time, one of these things that's got so many useful things. Look at all this stuff. And what we're looking for is delta time. And that means that it's the amount of time since last frame. So basically, we're subtracting 1 second per second from our time variable. And when we say if time is less than or equal to 0, then destroy game object. This is something you're probably going to end up using a lot, time.delta time. And so I wanted to make sure that you got to see it. Now with that in mind, we'll just go ahead and add that and watch it happen. If you keep your eye on the left, you can see the explosions pop up, and then you can see them go away after 5 seconds. There we are. See? So that is how you do it. It's pretty basic, and almost everything you want to do is based on this exact same premise. It's all about figuring out what events you're hanging yourself with, and then figuring out what you want to do during those events. And that is a super basic overview of how to program in C#. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you have any more questions, let me know below.